Good Erev Shabbos. As we all know, Judaism does not limit its reach into our lives to moments of pure spirituality, to prayer, worship, and ritual. Halacha touches on and regulates every aspect of our lives, from the way we wake up in the morning, to how we eat, to how we marry and start families, to how we mourn our loved ones. It's not surprising that Jewish law in the Torah also explicitly addresses a major milestone that many people experience in their lives: the purchase or construction of a new home. Now, there are a number of different aspects of moving to a new home that we might have thought would be discussed in the Torah. Perhaps a room of the house would need to be dedicated to Hashem or set aside for some kind of ritual. Maybe the Torah would discuss in more detail the need for mezuzot or other religious texts in the home. We could imagine a verse requiring an offering, a donation of some sort to celebrate the occasion of building a new home. After all, the Torah does seem to state explicitly that celebrating a new house properly is absolutely essential. That the plain meaning of a verse in last week's Torah reading said that a soldier can be exempted from military draft if he recently constructed a new home, but has not yet moved in or had a dedication ceremony of some sort to celebrate it. Right? That he doesn't have to go to war if he has built a new home and hasn't dedicated. But the official shall say to the troops as follows: whoever is somebody that has built a brand new house but has not yet dedicated it, Yashov Veto, he should go home, not go out to war, lest he die in the war and somebody else will have to dedicate it, meaning someone else will take it instead. But the Torah does not mention anything about rituals or blessings or prayers or any sort of religious regulation in the context of building or purchasing a house. Instead, the only mitzvah, the only halacha connected to this important moment in one's life is a requirement to have a parapet on the roof, to have a ma'aka. Ki tivneh bayit chadash, when you build a new house, you have to make a parapet on the roof, so that you don't spill any blood in your house, lest somebody fall from it. So that's a pretty strange choice. Why would the Torah, of all things, focus on having a railing or a wall on the roof? Why does the Torah make the Makkah the focus of the experience of constructing a new house? So the Sefer HaChinuch, as he almost always does in his discussion of each Parshat list of commandments, discusses the reasoning behind this mitzvah. And he writes that the logic behind the mitzvah is that we know that random dangers present themselves all the time throughout our lives, and it's the nature of the world as God determined it, that if something causes us to fall off a roof from a great height, that we're going to get hurt, or we might even chas v'shalom die. And we might have thought, in our naive moments, that Hashem will protect us from those dangers because He doesn't want us to die, and so it's not necessary to take precautions to keep ourselves safe. So, therefore, the Torah explicitly mentions this one requirement of having a parapet on the roof of a new house to serve as a model for how we should act in the face of any danger, that we should take it seriously. We have to have common sense, and we have to take precautions and not rely on miracles. So we have to keep ourselves safe. This is just an example of that principle. Simply put, according to the Sefer HaChinuch, the mitzvah requires us to put in place appropriate precautions to protect ourselves from danger and to avoid any unnecessary risks to our health and safety. And based on comments by the Rambam, by Maimonides, Rav Eliezer Melamed extends this logic to a ban on smoking nowadays, which we now know to be a significant threat to one's long-term health, to our lungs. Rabbi Norman Lamb, in a sermon delivered in 1962, lamented the pharmaceutical greed that led to many babies being born with significant deformities or disabilities due to their mothers being prescribed the dangerous drug thalidomide to relieve them from pregnancy nausea. They took this drug, they didn't know what would happen to their babies, and it turned out that in part it was approved and people were prescribed this drug because of the greed of the pharmaceutical companies. The commandment of the parapet of the Makkah highlights the Torah value of putting safety first before profit. And this feels particularly relevant to us as the world races toward developing and mass producing vaccines or therapeutics to treat or prevent COVID-19 and end the worldwide pandemic. Of course, we're not anti-vaxxers. We believe in the effectiveness of medicine, and we do trust that doctors and scientists can produce and under the proper regulations and testing can produce something that will keep us safe. But we have to be vigilant to ensure that that essential steps are not skipped in the drug development process in the name of greed or political self-interest, and that whatever ends up being prescribed to us is actually safe and trustworthy and will do the job. Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch suggests that the mitzvah of Makkah actually has an even more profound message than the requirement to take care to preserve our own personal health and safety. He says that by limiting the mitzvot associated with building a new home to the requirement of a Makkah, a parapet on the roof, the Torah is teaching us that when we build a new home, we must not only have ourselves in mind, we must also consider future residents of our homes. He suggests that this explains why the mitzvah of Makkah is immediately preceded by the mitzvah of sending away a mother bird from her nest before taking her eggs or chicks. The Torah is intentionally contrasting human morality with that of the animal kingdom. That whereas a bird builds its nests only considering the needs of itself and its offspring, human beings must consider also the safety of people who will live in the structures and institutions that we build long after we are gone, or even if, and consider how they affect other people that are not ourselves and not our own families. And one application of this idea is the concept of universal design. When we construct homes or bridges or buildings, when we design roads or household items or even computer programs, we have to make them as safe and accessible as possible to consider the needs of others beyond our own. We can't just build a home that is safe for us based on our own preferences and tendencies. For example, until the 1990 passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, sidewalks often did not have curb ramps, which made it very difficult for people in wheelchairs or people with difficulty walking to travel. But after the law of the ADA was passed in 1990, and most sidewalks were changed to include curb ramps, it became apparent that making sidewalks more accessible benefited everyone, even those who did not have trouble walking, such as parents pushing strollers. Universal design is something that obviously benefits others that are not ourselves, and we have to consider their needs. And universal design also ends up helping us, even when we don't realize it. In fact, as Rabbi Lamb notes, the Gemara in Bava Kama says that it's prohibited to own a scary dog because it might scare other people, might cause other people to be afraid, might cause discomfort. In other words, even if the danger is minimal, there's no danger at all, we're required to avoid anything that would cause others to experience unnecessary fear or discomfort. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Rimanov, a Hasidic Rebbe, was once gifted a large, expensive table for his home, and he was happy to accept the gift and placed it in a prominent place in his home. But one day, the Rebbe's young son had a neighbor friend over to play in their home, and the boys began chasing each other around the table until the neighbor boy bumped his head on one of the table's corners. And the boy, who was startled, cried only for a minute and then quickly recovered and went back to playing. Nonetheless, in fulfillment of this mitzvah of Makkah, Rav Menachem Mendel of Rimanov had the corners of the table rounded off and taken off to prevent that from happening again, so that no one should be caused even momentary pain or discomfort. This idea of Rav Hirsch that the Torah instructs us to consider how the designs of our homes and household items will affect others should not be limited to physical structures and objects alone. In education, there is a concept called UDL, Universal Design of Learning, a way of thinking about lesson planning and classroom design that tries to make learning universally and equally accessible to students with a wide variety of learning needs and styles. But it goes beyond that as well. Our institutions, not just the physical buildings, but the hierarchies, rules, and systems of accountability must also be built with a universal design mindset. The United States of America right now, in 2020, is going through a period of reckoning over systemic racism. And systemic racism means that perhaps intentionally, perhaps unconsciously, the people in power who created the systems that we rely on in our society put in place or are perpetuating systems that in practice create wide gaps between different groups of people in the way that they're treated. For example, if housing for one group of people is relatively widely available and mobility is simple, while for another group housing availability is very limited and mobility is difficult, that is a system that does not consider the needs of everyone equally. That is systemic racism. If there are huge differences in educational outcomes, wealth distribution, health, criminal justice, and treatment by law enforcement between Black Americans and white Americans, that means that those systems were not created with universal design in mind. No marker was put up by people in power to ensure that all communities would have the same access to safety, health, and growth as their own. The Torah teaches us to build a parapet, to build a marker, a protective wall that takes into account the safety needs of people who will live after us, people who are not ourselves or our family. We need to make sure that we apply this not only to our physical homes, but also to our communities and to our society. We must take into account whether systems of our government are universally designed or whether they need to be reformed to be more inclusive, to give equal opportunity and fairness to all people. We need to ensure that we take care of our environment and reduce carbon consumption, not only because of how it affects us, but also to consider how it will affect future generations that will come after us. As we build or rebuild our world following this pandemic, may we merit to fulfill the mitzvah of Makkah properly in this expanded sense and fulfill the words of our Hirsch that in building his house, a person must be motivated from the outset by consideration for the welfare not only of those people who will dwell in it at present, but also those who may dwell there in the future. I want to wish you a safe and enjoyable Shabbat.